Indeed, when we consider about using the diary studies, there are several methods that we can choose. The number one is experience sampling. You can ask the employees, you can ask the respondents to what experience that you have for certain period of time, over a period of time. The second thing is events sampling. Whenever they got some certain event, and so you ask them what emotion, what thinking, what thoughts, what behavior that you have. So these are the events sampling. Or some of the research design can use the daily diary studies. You can ask the respondents to report to you what do they do on a daily basis. And so here are some of the examples that we can consider, some of the method that we can consider when we are using the diary study research design. By definition, experience sampling method, ESM, refers to the features repeated measures of the same participants as they go about their daily lives, with a focus on assessing the variable that fluctuate over the short period of time. Indeed, by having an example of my daughter and our trips to Hangzhou, as you can see that we captured the repeated measurement. We ask whether my daughter is very happy or not, the repeated measurement of the same participant, my daughter, every day. And so to see whether there is a fluctuation of the happiness over the week, over the short period of time, a week in Hangzhou. And so you can see that the key feature is the repeated measurement. You ask the same participants, but for many, many times, maybe on the daily basis or on the hourly basis, on a weekly basis, but with the repeated measurement. And so the key is to see whether there is a fluctuation of those measurements over the short period of time. The experience sampling method, ESM, involved in situations, signal contingent, record of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So this research methodology is to use to capture the fluctuation, the contingency sense of the thoughts, behavior, and feelings of the individuals. For example, if the participants can use a handheld computer or a smartphone, the computer apps can help the program to capture, to give a random signal or the signal at a fixed time point in order to remind and request the participants to fill in the questionnaires and report their current experience. And in recent time, it is commonly used in the field of organizational psychology because it is quite interesting to investigate people's behavior as the function of both their people characteristic as well as in certain situation and how their thoughts and behavior will change. And so this is quite interesting and useful tools in the organizational psychology area. As we mentioned earlier, there are different types of diary research design. In the case of events sampling, participants have to report in events, for example, like the interaction with the customers, the supervisor, or their colleagues, a conflict, or a stressful events. Whenever the events happened, and so they have to report to the researchers immediately. There are some of the example questions that we can see for the diary related to the events, such as, was there a conflict in the interaction? Yes, I know. Could the conflict be resolved completely to not at all? How satisfied were you with the result? Very satisfied to not at all satisfied. And so you can see that the diary should be filled out immediately after events. This could mean dealing or handling with the diary while working. So whenever the events happen just after the events happened, and so the respondents need to report to the researchers immediately. Because these procedures may interrupt the work process, and filling out the diary while working is often impossible. Sometimes because these are ongoing work, and so you cannot, or it is not feasible to ask the respondents to report to you immediately after the events happen. So this may be one of the problems that we should consider when we are using the event samples. For some practical reasons, in many studies using the event sampling method, the participants are required to fill out the diary after work because they do not want to disturb their work, they do not want to interrupt the work process, so that's why they just ask them to report after work. And here is the distinction between the event sampling and the daily assessment is very ambiguous because on one hand you will want to capture what had happened immediately after the events. On the other hand, it may also affecting and interrupt their work. So that's why we have to make a balance between that. We have to consider whether we have to use the event sampling or we just ask them to do the assessment after work. A problem in the event sampling is to limit the number of events that have to be reported because remember that if you want to capture information about interaction with the customers, the service providers, because they have to serve different customers over a period of time. If you ask them to report immediately after each of the interaction, it seems a loss of the interruption to their work. So we can only limit the number of the events that have to be reported and give the participants a guideline which events should be reported. Should it be the big event or all the events? And so we also need to make a balance between them. And for in classical event sampling studies, participants are required to report the social interaction lasting 10 minutes or more. And so, well, for those interaction, if they last for longer, and so we can capture this as an important event. Other study asked to report one important interaction of the date, and so we ask the participants to record the most important interaction of the date, and so well to see and how this will affecting the people's behavior and well their thinking. And another possibility is to ask for the particular interaction. For example, like well, the first interaction after the break. And so anyway, we have to give the very clear guideline to the participants to which events that they have to report to. Otherwise, well, many events that will happen over a period of time, and so it will create a loss of the unnecessary and irrelevant information to the researchers. Different from the event sampling methodology, daily assessment refers to the experience and process occurring during the day without referring to a particular event, not because of the particular event. Instead of, the respondents were asked to evaluate on a fluctuating variable at a daily basis. Usually, they are asked to fill out at the end of the day. Like a longitudinal study, the response could be lagged because remember that maybe something already happened in the morning, but if you ask the respondents to report at the end of the day, it's already have the time lag, and you also have the problem that the employees, the respondents may not easily recall what has already happened in the morning. Some of the example questions could be to analyze the workload of the day and fatigue and the mood, etc. in the morning and after work, and to see does daily workload will predict after work fatigue when controlling for the morning fatigue. And so it's on the daily basis to test whether the workload on daily basis will affecting the after work fatigue. And for this type of the research questions, we have to use the daily assessment research methodology design. In comparison to the traditional survey design, there are some advantages of diary studies. Number one, data can be collected on a daily basis or even several times a day. And so in some of the research, the researchers will collect the data in the morning, afternoon, or at night so that to collect the data at many different time points in a day to see the fluctuations at different time points in a day. It is different from the longitudinal research design because we that have a longer time lag, usually like different several months, several weeks, or even years. By using diary method, researchers can gather data in people's natural life context and so is closer to the realistic situation. And also, it will help to reduce the bias due to asking the respondents to recall their memory. Because remember that if you are using a longitudinal research design or traditional survey design, we usually ask the respondents to recall what had already happened in a period of time, and so probably a lot of the bias and missing information occurred. So that's why using the diary study can help to reduce those bias. Besides that, the diary study can also have an open format where the participants record events, thoughts, feelings, and behavior using their own words. And so usually, because it may not be necessary to standardize the questions, instead, we can ask them to discuss what they feel, what do they do, what did they behave, and what events already happened, and so was not only using those standardized questions. Also, the highly structured diaries using standardized questions in the case that they can also supplement with the short questionnaires so that you're just asking them to work on 5 to 7 minutes, so that's very different from the longitudinal as well as the traditional survey design. Remember that the diary studies cannot be very long, otherwise it will upset and also will make the respondents very boring because when we have to collect the data, the same measurement, but at different time point for many times on the same um, employees, on the same respondents. So that's why we have to keep the questionnaire short. Therefore, in conclusion, why do we need to have experience sampling method ESM? Number one, the key is to reduce the bias and error for reporting general experience. Instead of the traditional survey, we'll capture the general experience. ESM will help us to understand the experience at certain time point. Number two is to study the within person process, that is the fluctuations of the measurements, the variables as they unfold over time. In this section, we've already covered some basic concept and importance of ESM. In the next video, we will continue to talk about some example of ESM.